Right. Good afternoon and welcome to today's lecture. So like I did mention earlier on, today's lecture will be in two parts. The first part has to do with us going through a bit of interest and then systems evaluation. And then the second part of the lecture will involve us going through some worksheets, right, to be able to going through some worksheets, which will be part of I think you have another quiz coming up. That quiz will involve some of the things we've gone through in the past few weeks, time value of money, cash flow considerations, those kind of stuff. So, last week we did talk about the time value of money, where we talked about interest rate, we talked about NPV, internal rate of return, and then being able to make evaluation on a project. One thing I did not mention was when it comes to interest rate, right, there's also something called the nominal annual rate of interest. So typically when you go in for a loan from a bank, right, over here we are making the assumption that, last week we did make the assumption that when you go in for a loan from a bank or you are making your evaluation, your money, it's paid annually, right? But sometimes you go in for money from a bank and maybe it's over an 18-month period, or maybe 20 months period or 30 months period, right? In that case, what it means is that your interest rate, right, which is I, right, needs to be converted to an approximate period. So if the interest rate at the nominal rate of, so let's assume you went for an interest which was R per year, 12% per year, or whatever, right? And you want you to be able to convert it to a period, it has to be that interest rate divided by M, which is the number of periods. So if the M is, let's say, 20 months, you divide your 12 by what? Your 20 months. So what we're trying to get here is, how, when you convert the interest into monthly period, how much will it come up to? But then don't forget that we're talking about a compounded interest rate, right? Which means that for whatever, if you convert the interest rate to month 1, at the end of month 2, what you are paying will be what your your interest plus the principal plus the interest of, let's say, the first year. So typically what you have is that if you were to go in for an interest rate, if you were to go in for a loan of, let's say, 2 million, right, that means an interest of maybe 12% per annum. Right. Let's assume you're supposed to have paid this money.
So you have to improve your handwriting. Jesus. What is that? 12% per annum? Yeah.
Let's assume you went in for a loan, right, of £2 million, right, at an interest rate.
Make it 200,000.
Sorry?
2,000.
At an interest rate of 12% per annum. Right. And let's assume the duration. Let's say maybe 20 months. Right. What you realize here is that, at the end of the day, right, the rate of interest is compounded. We are compounding it, which means that maybe you're supposed to be paid at the end of every month. The bank will require you to do a series of payments, right? Month 1, you're supposed to pay a certain amount of this 2 million. Month 2, you're supposed to pay. So what you want to know is that what will be the effective interest rate? And that rate, it's typically given by this formula. Your effective annual interest rate will be given by 1 plus I over n raised to the power n minus 1. So if you get that effective interest rate, it helps you to be able to determine or calculate what will be the average interest amount you'll be paying per month.
What is N?
Sorry,
What is N? The number of years?
the end can be number of years or the number of. So here we have a duration of 20 months.
Yeah.
20 months.
20 months. So in this case, our I will be what? 12%. And then the N we have here, which is the number, which N here will be 20 what?
Yes.
Months. Because we are dealing in monthly period.
Yes.
Right. If we were to be paying, let's say, if the duration were to be maybe quarterly, we have like, let's say, 8 quarters to pay. Right? The N here will be what? 8 quarters. So N is always the your payment, your number of compounding periods. It can be daily period, it can be monthly period. So depending on what's given, yeah, that's what you use. So typically, if you were to go by the formula, right, and maybe you went for a loan, let's say, at a nominal rate of 1%, right, and you had what? You were supposed to pay that money semi-annually, right, which means what's 2 times per year, right. The effective interest rate will be 1.03% based on this formula, right. If the loan were to be, let's say, 10%, and you were paying that loan on monthly basis, right, the effective interest rate will be what? 10.47%, mainly because it's compounded. So that means for every month, this is what you are paying at the end of what? Every month. If that same loan were to be paid what? On daily basis, right, it means if the effective rate you are paying for that loan is 10.25 what? %. So what you realize is that the longer the period for payment, the shorter the number of cycles you have, the cheaper it becomes. But if the more it is, the higher it becomes. So this was 10.25% and that's 10.35%. So actually going for loans from banks, for personal or let's say for project, you need to have an idea of what a monthly or let's say annual or quarterly effective interest rate becomes.
So how do you know if it is effective or not from your side?
From your side?
Yeah, you are going to get that loan from the bank, and you don't know if this interest rate is going to be effective or not. How you evaluate it?
When you go for a loan from a bank, the bank always tells you the interest rate they are giving you the loan for, or the money they are giving you the loan. If you go to a bank for now, right, and you want to go for let's say 100,000. You probably negotiate with them and tell them I want this loan, and then they will tell you, okay, they can give you that loan at maybe 12% rate per annum, right? But then you probably need to pay that money on a monthly basis.
Sure, but I'm asking, how do you know? How do
It's
you
in the
know?
terms and conditions,
No, this is not the question. How do you know if this percentage is effective from your side or not? Because you are paying back this interest,
Yeah.
right? So how do you know if this payment amount is effective or not throughout the project?
No, so that will depend on the profit your project will make,
Exactly.
right? So
So
that will
if
determine.
you don't know what is the exact amount of profit you're gonna make,
Yeah, you wouldn't be able to calculate whether the rate
so
you're
to be
contracting.
again estimated.
Yeah, you need to estimate it. So that's where the cash flow projections come in, the future value of income. So that's what we went through. So all this are done in conjunction with what we did the last. I should have mentioned this last week, but we didn't. Right. So that's what you do. But then also sometimes we also have the case where a nominal interest rate where maybe you go in for a loan which is less than a year. Right, you're going for a loan which is less than a year. And in that case, it's always lower than the equivalent rate of annual compounded. Maybe you went to the bank for a loan for let's say 12%, right? Or let's say a loan for 8.5%. You're supposed to have paid that loan in 1 year, right, which is 12 months. but then you were able to pay that loan after what, just 12 weeks. Right, we have 52 weeks in a year, but then you're able to pay that loan in just 12 weeks. So you want to know, right, in calculating the total interest you're supposed to pay to the bank, it will definitely not be the total of what, the 8.5%. You want to know how much interest you have to pay on that amount. For instance, if, for example, we take out a loan that has been quoted with an annual interest percentage rate of 8.5% and manage to repay it after 12 weeks. So if the loan had gone for a full year, you're supposed to have paid 8.5%. But now, rather than go for the full year of 8.5, you manage to pay it what, after 12 weeks. So how do we calculate the repayment amount? How much to pay to the bank? Right. I mean, here, like we said, it would be easy enough if we had waited a full year, but it's best to learn how to be able to pay, to work with what, a range of repayment dates. Right. So what we have to do here, what we have to do here is to be out. We realize that if we had, let's say, if we calculated compounded interest on a daily basis, right, call this X% and claim that the effective annual rate is called Y. So what happens is that, maybe you wanted to pay to the bank. You wanted to pay the interest in smaller division. You wanted to pay on weekly basis, right? Which is what we have here, I of X, which is the number of divisions. It could also be that you were paying in months. In paying to the bank, you could have paid in weeks, you could have paid in months. And this is the annual interest rate. So what we are trying to do is that if we pay 1 plus I of X. X here means that the number of the periods we are paying. This could be months, this could be weeks, this could be months, this could be weeks. What we are saying here is that 1 plus I, if we compound it to the future value, which is the power X, should be equal to 1 plus I over Y, which is the number of years we had at the end of the day. So solving for I of X will be equal to 1 plus I raised to the power Y, 1 plus I over Y raised to the power Y over X minus 1. What we're trying to do here is that if you took a loan from a bank, right, and you wanted to maybe, rather than wait for the full year, the loan was 10% or 5%, rather than wait for the full year, you want to be able to pay on weekly basis or on monthly basis. You want to know the effective, what sort of interest rate that will come up to, because you wouldn't get to pay the full interest rate. So what happens is if you took the loan at 6%, right, and you were supposed to have paid that loan in 1 year, right, but then you wanted to pay it on monthly basis. You want to know at the end of every month how much interest you need to pay on that loan. So the percentage to use for that, if we were to go by that formula, which was I of X being equal to 1 plus I of Y so let's take the case of maybe assuming our interest rate it's 6% per annum. We wanted to pay that over 12 monthly, over 12 months, right? Which means our payment cycle is what? Monthly. In this case, the X stands for the monthly period, which is the our payments time. So to be able to calculate the effective interest rate on monthly basis, which is I of X, it will be 1 plus the interest rate for Y. Y is always your annual interest rate, right, which is the bigger one. We're taking the interest rate per annum of what? 6%. So 1 plus 6% into bracket y over x, right, which is y here, it's still what? 6 over x, which is the number of what? Period. Here, our x, the number of period is what? 12, because we are going monthly basis, and then what? Minus 1. So that's how, if you calculate for that, you get a monthly rate of 0.49%. And the same way, if we do it, if the divisions have been 6, right, where maybe, if the divisions have been 6 in a year, you wanted to make 6 equal payment, right, which means your payment should be at the end of every 2 months. In that case, our y over x would have been what? 6 over 6, because we wanted to make our payment over 6 equal period.
1 plus 6%, how much is it?
So 1.06.
No, 1 plus 6%.
Yeah.
So how do you add this?
1.06. It's 1.06.
Yes, yes. But then this percentage, the 0.49, it represents what?
Sorry?
The percentages.
Yeah.
Percentage to use it from where?
In terms of how much to know, so it's the interest rate you are using to be able to know. So if you borrow, let's say, for whatever amount you borrowed, depending on, and maybe you wanted to pay it over maybe 20 months, and that was the interest rate, you want to be able to calculate how much interest you'll be paying on a monthly basis.
So this percentage represents a small part of the amount you borrowed from the bank?
Yeah, the
And
interest
that's payable.
component, the interest component, not the principal. So the percentage is the interest component of what you need to pay to the bank. So if it were to be, let's say, if we start with an annual equivalent of say 12%, right? The interest rate was 12%, but then we wanted to do what? Pay on daily basis, right? In that case, we have what? X being equal to 365, because we want to know the interest we need to pay on daily basis. Our formula would now be what? 1 plus the I of y is it's supposed to be 12. Division of an annualized interest of 6%. Okay, yeah, so reasons 0.06 into bracket y over what? X, which is 1 over 365 minus what? 1. So the interest rate becomes 0.016. We'll go through some.
So is one going to be always a fixed value for the formula?
The one here.
The one here and the minus one at the end. Is that always going to be
Yeah,
fixed?
that's always fixed. It doesn't change. It's always part of the formula. It's always part of the formula. It doesn't change. So typically, when you borrow from a bank, right, and you want to know, because you basically will be paying money to the bank over a period. You want to know or negotiate, maybe you probably want to negotiate with a bank that you pay them on monthly basis or every quarter or half annually. It helps you know the effective interest rate. It's something I should have mentioned last week. Yeah. Today we want to look more at systems evaluation, right? What it does is we want to be able to know if you have, let's say, 2 different systems on a project. Like if you wanted to evaluate between a photovoltaic and a solar panel, right? How do you go about it? If you wanted to evaluate between 2 different boiler systems, how do you go about it, right? Basically systems of project evaluation, they are a set of techniques for evaluating effectiveness, value, and quality. Right. Last week we were mainly looking at the financial aspect of project, whereby we did not consider the maintenance cost. We just look at the net present value of money. But right, when it comes to systems evaluation, we're also considering how effective the plant is, its value, and what quality as well. So, basically, for systems evaluation, right, you're able to use it to make what strategic business or management decisions. You're able to also use it when it comes to engineering economics, right? For instance, you're supposed to be on a project whereby you need to make some sort of analysis regarding some elevator or some escalator system. You as the engineer will need to be able to know the sort of parameters to be able to evaluate from it. So for today, we'll be going through some examples, and then we'll also do some worksheet to practice on that. Typically, when it comes to project evaluation, there are various ways we can go about it, right? I mean, we have the engineering economics bit, and then we also have the NPV, which we talked about, where you're able to convert what the value of the project into the present value. You also make use of what internal rate of return. There are also cases where you make use of the life cycle cost, right? You consider what the cost of the system or plant over its whole life cycle. You look at the initial cost, you look at the maintenance cost, and then the replacement cost. And then also we have the cost benefit analysis, where you basically look at, okay, what's the cost of this? What benefits am I getting from it in terms of income? Is it worth it going into that project? I mean, long-term wise, am I likely to make money from it? Right, so that's there are various parameters which you can use to evaluate projects. They are applied in various areas, right? When it comes to transportation, you probably may want to determine that maybe you are the Minister of Transport, you want to determine whether a road is much more effective or you want to go in for rail. You probably want to be able to assess whether building an additional airport between two different towns would be better, or having some form of rail transport, or maybe will a high-speed rail be better than a road? You want to be able to evaluate that based on some financial parameters. And then also you want to be able to use it for water resource management. Sometimes you want to consider whether you want to build one huge dam or build a series of dams in different locations, right? Which means you probably need to consider the cost of the dam, a huge dam, and the cost of connecting pipe works from that huge dam to the various towns. Or maybe would it be best to have a number of smaller dams in every town and then connect pipe works to those dams? So you need to be able to evaluate that as well. And then for those in telecommunication, they also make use of some of the system evaluation to make their investment decisions. Right. This basically has to do with the differences between when it comes to engineering and economics, what each of these disciplines look out for when it comes to projects. Engineering mostly are concerned with making a balance of what cost, schedule, and what quality. Those are key parameters for you, right? And often, when it comes to engineering, we make use of models. It's more of assumptions, future prediction. We are not very certain, but then we need to make reasonable assumptions, because without making those assumptions, there's no way you will be able to predict your estimate. But then, the difficult thing about engineering or construction projects is that they are typically hard to predict. You do realize that even we say preliminary cost estimate, they are estimates and that they are not absolute figures. You are making those assumptions based on what you think you know now, right? That's what they are estimates rather than actual figures. So they are usually difficult to predict, and most times when you go onto projects, what actually happens in the project, it's not maybe different from what you predicted, right? For instance, you may make the assumption that you probably may want to go in with a pad foundation. You may have done your initial design, but you get onto site and you realize maybe there's some sort of groundwater on the site, even with the site investigation they did not reveal. And they may have to change from a pad to a raft foundation, right? And then sometimes, as the project is ongoing, there are some changes which happen on the project. Or even sometimes you predict for maybe a life cycle of 10 years or 15 years, and you predict an income of 15 for that 15 years. but maybe due to changes in the economy, you're not able to get the exact income what you predicted. So engineering and construction projects are what very hard to predict, right? And then there are so many unknown variables. I mean, sometimes when you are doing your analysis, you kind of make an assumption for what your discount rate, right? Which is based on inflation and based on the cost of borrowing. Sometimes you make an assumption for what the income, the expected income, maybe based on the fact that within Oxford, maybe other office facilities are being rented for, let's say, £20 a square meter or £30 a square meter. So you predict that maybe in 3 years' time, when you are done with your project, offices may rise up to maybe £25 a square meter. But it may be that by the end of that 3 years, prices do not rise, right? And then you also have issues of what cost overruns, which are well known in projects. I mean, very few projects, most of the major projects have experienced what cost and schedule overruns. So you also want to be able to get around that as well. But then we still need to be able to we still need to forecast, we still need to plan, because without planning, there's no way we can come to a decision on project. The only thing is, when you are going through that planning, you need to make sure that the assumptions you are making are very realistic. You'll be able to defend those assumptions, right? So at that particular point in time, you're making those assumptions. You're making them based on information you know, not because you are falsely representing that information. There is a concept of what's called equivalence, economic equivalence when it comes to projects, right? So because there are various dimensions or various ways of evaluating a project, we have this concept of economic equivalence where we say we become indifferent between a future payment or a series of future payments, so that what you are trying to do is you have 2 or 3 different projects you need to evaluate, right? There are various parameters you can evaluate them on. You can evaluate them based on what quality. For instance, if you have, let's say, 2 lift installations, you can evaluate them based on, let's say, their energy efficiency. You could also evaluate them based on their life cycle. But then, typically, we tend to evaluate them based in economic equivalence. We focus more on the cost or the cost, right? And we try to say that at a certain period, at maybe an interest rate X, or maybe at interest rate of 5% over a 10-year cycle, these 2 systems have the same equivalent. There are no differences in them, right? So, the importance of economic equivalence is that it's much more convenient to be able to compare your present values than the complex cash flows associated with competing projects. So sometimes what happens is that every project has different cash flow parameters, right? If you have, let's say, a residential building and an office building, the cash flow forecast for these 2 projects may be different. But then, to be able to compare these 2 projects, it's always easy to be able to bring it into the present value. Present value means that you have a common basis to be able to compare this project. If I tell you maybe an office building, if you draw the cash flow for an office building, and if you draw the cash flow for a residential building, it's sometimes relatively difficult comparing or making a decision between these 2 cash flows. But if you're able to convert these 2 cash flows into the present value, right? Convert your future income into the present, you have a sort of common basis to compare these 2 projects. And if these 2 projects are able to give you the same present value basis, then they typically they have what's called the economic equivalent, because they have the same value. So last week we did look at one of this where we looked at, a project, 3 different projects where we're trying to compare them. So for instance, let's take this project, right? This project, the cost is £75,000. The expected income is £100,000 over 1 year. Whereas for this project, over 2 years, you have an income of what, £200. And for project 3, you have a total income of over £400. You realize that if you were to look at just the cash flow alone, right, it's a bit difficult to be able to compare them because they all have a different cash flow period, right? Your gross profit are the same. So what happens? You have a gross profit being the same. The best way you'll be able to compare these 4 projects is to make use of the net present value. By converting your future incomes into NPV or the present values, you are able to have a common basis or a baseline to compare the 4 projects. So here what we did was to convert the future income into present values, which came up to the present value for this project is £19, whereas the present value of this project, the net present value of this project is 33, and this was 47 and 221. So by having your NPV, the net present value, you are able to make a decision on which project is more effective or which project gives you the best of return on project. So typically when you have to compare between 2 or 3 projects, you always try to, if you have the cash flow, make sure you're able to convert it to the net present value.
Can I ask something here?
Yeah.
In the coursework we are doing, the feasibility study, there are 2 types of feasibility study. Initial feasibility study is before the concept design stage, and there's another feasibility study in the detailed design stage, right? The one which is the initial one, okay, in this one you can't compare between different options and you can assess different alternatives, right? In the initial feasibility, but the one that we are given, it is, okay, you say it is an initial feasibility, but I don't see it as an initial feasibility because the site is already given and there is a concept design. So, I mean, we can't use this term of evaluation because we don't have any other alternatives. We have one project which is already selected, the site is selected, and there is a conceptual design as well. So what do you think will happen in this case?
No, on the project we're giving you, it's a sample, it's a coursework. That's how come we gave you parameters to work with them. It's a coursework. But in real life, if you were to make an evaluation of a project, obviously you may have identified a site, right? You may have the site in mind. I mean, if you were to be an investor, you may identify that, okay, this site looks interesting, right? And then you probably will talk to an architect. What are the possible alternatives you can do on this site? It could be you want to do maybe an office block. It could be you want to do residential or a mixed-use development, right? Then you just talk about, okay, when it comes to an office block, what floor space are we likely to build? So you make those assumptions, and then you tell the architect, okay, this is my budget. My budget is maybe 2 million or 3 million pounds for the project. And you are able to compare the possible or likely income from all these 3 different types of projects.
Yeah.
And then based on that, you make a decision.
This is what I'm saying, but in the case of the coursework, we have this option only, that we have to assess it only. So.
Yeah, so in the case of the coursework, what we're trying to, the focus here is we're trying to assess if the project, it's profitable or makes sense to embark on. Exactly. So here, you typically may have a case where a client will come to you and the client may say, I want to do some sort of hostel, I want to do a hotel on this land, right? So you as the consultant or you as a quantity surveyor, you're helping the client to assess whether it makes sense for the client to embark on that project. So that's what we're trying to do. Rather than evaluate between 2 or 3 different options, the client has a scenario and you kind of providing a feedback to the client to assess whether the project is profitable or not. And if it's not profitable, what can be done to make it profitable? Possibly it could be that 1 or 2 of those blocks in the project are not generating enough income. So you could advise the client that maybe we should skip that. Or it could be the case that maybe the land cost is too high. You get it?
Understood.
So if you use the residual, we have an approach called the residual valuation method where it helps you assess what you can pay for a land to be able to make your project profitable. I think in the Excel, the developer budget I put on there, I use the residual valuation method. The residual valuation method simply It's an approach where, I mean, if you are a developer, right, you've not been able to buy the land yet. You've located the land, but maybe you've been able to come up, okay, I think this is how much the project will cost me. These are my likely source of revenue over the next 10 years or 15 years. And based on that, this is my net present value, right? So then how much is it that if I pay, you've also estimated your profit percentage you want to make. Maybe on that project you want to make 10% or 15%. So then you ask yourself, how much should I pay for this land to be able to make a profit of 10 or 15%? So the residual valuation helps you establish a maximum value you can pay for the land. Right.
Thank you.
Can I quickly just ask one question, since it's about the coursework? The cash flow itself is quite big and long, because it's about 40 odd years, isn't it?
Yeah.
Are you happy for us just to put the diagrams in? I know I'm just
Diagram?
reading the brief as well.
Like Excel sheet?
No, not the spreadsheet, just the cumulative income against the cumulative expenditure. The outputs, inflows against the outputs.
No, I think.
You know, one of your slides has those diagrams on it.
Which diagrams? Because I have quite a number of diagrams.
Last week, one of your slides, because because it's only 3,000 words,
Yeah.
and if I put the spreadsheet in,
No, so the spreadsheet you can just kind of copy and paste. Like, because George,
as an image,
yeah, because
then there won't be any words, but then you won't.
I think if you
will
look,
not- you will not mark me down for being clever.
if you look somewhere in the,
It's the brief over here, I've got that out, yeah.
yeah, I think George did mention something like that. Cash flow assumptions.
So, just a direct question, I don't mean to offend you. Who's marking the assignment, you or George?
George.
Who's marking?
Well, George, between George and myself, we split it.
Because the problem is, if you have a different marking style, I might end up losing marks there.
No. At the end of the day,
I'll be very direct
no,
with
I'm
you.
coming. At the end of the day, before we start marking, we'll all come to an agreement. I mean, George will have a marking
But if you
scheme.
want the spreadsheet, I can bet you, if I put that as an image, it's not gonna be as a word count. If I just put the spreadsheet, I've done the cash flow, few of us have done it, and it's tallying the figures and everything, but Chris, it's gonna be more than 3,000 words. Straight away, if I just drop the spreadsheet itself.
Let's talk about it. Let's talk about it after.
Yeah, so
Let's talk
all
about
we
it.
need is a very consistent set of instructions here, where I'm coming from. If you just want the diagrams, I'm happy to put the diagrams in, that's it.
Okay. Don't worry. Let's talk about it. Yeah.
All right.
Let's talk
So I
about
don't mean to disrupt or anything,
it.
but,
No, that's fine.
yeah.
That's fine. So typically, when evaluating projects, right, it's always best to convert whatever your incomes into the present value. So for instance, if you had, let's say, if you wanted to receive £1,000, right, like we did mention, if you wanted to receive £1,000 in 5 years, right, and maybe you had an interest rate of 20%, how much should you invest now? If you invested £400 now for 5 years, you will receive £1,000. So you should always know what your expected likely income or what you want to get at the end of the project. And based on that, you know how much you would need to invest at any time T. Right. Comparing alternative based on income and cost. Right. Here we want to look at which set of projects we prefer and why. If you have, let's say, 2 or 3 different systems, right, which installed alternative is the best system? If we wanted to make an alternative between an Otis and maybe a Samsung lift system, which one will be the best? Right. So here we look at this NPV, the IRR, the gross profit. There are various parameters you can use, which are the NPV, the IRR, gross profit, and NPV. But when it comes to real-world engineering choices, right, or real-world projects, the tricky thing is that most projects are very complex, right? Most projects are very complex, which means, one, it's a bit difficult to estimate your even cost of construction. It's a bit difficult to estimate your income. Like the project, the coursework you were given, you realize there were incomes coming in from so many sources, You had the student accommodation, you had the accommodation for I think the lecturers, and you have some market facilities and some summer accommodation that was rented over the summer. So when you have like large scale project, assume you had a mixed use development, you could probably have your anchor tenants paying rent, you could have other tenants, you could have maybe your restaurants paying a different rent, you could have a cinema, you could have open space where you probably rent to people that come to use the facility. So typically you have so many things what you need to consider. And then there are also other aspects other than pure finance, right? I mean, if you were to look at a HS2 or maybe some sort of real transportation, sometimes from a financial perspective, it may not always make sense in terms of generate or give you value for money. But sometimes it's a social infrastructure, right? Maybe you're trying to extend water supply to a remote village. I mean, if you look at it from a financial perspective, you may not really generate your profit on it, but you also need to know that without providing that water for the people, they are likely to get sick, or they may not be able to obtain some sort of social benefit. So there are some projects are just purely for the economic benefit, and some projects a mixture of economic and social benefits, right? And sometimes, so you as a project manager or the leader need to make a judgment in terms of, whether the project goes ahead or not. So it's quite important in there. Let's assume you have to specify a renewable energy source for a new build house, right? I mean, currently there's power, but then you needed to specify a renewable energy source. And you have to choose between two alternatives, a photovoltaic or solar thermal installation, right? This is what we have. We have the thermal solar plants, which helps you heat your boiler, and then we have a photovoltaic solar panel. Which one would you go for?
It depends.
Depends.
Yeah, on the scale of the building, it depends on the facilities, everything.
Yeah, but if both were providing you with the same amount of energy.
Returns,
Sorry? Why?
whichever returns quicker, less risk.
Sorry?
Whichever returns the value quicker in investment, that's less risk. That's it.
Whichever.
How many years did you say? Oh, sorry.
Let's assume you wanted any of these two options on your house.
Yes. If I was to put a solar panel on my house,
Yeah.
first thing would depend, am I going to get a credit or not? And if I do get a credit, how quickly can I recoup that money? My money, my pocket, simple rule of finance.
Your money in your pocket.
Absolutely, isn't it?
But you have to, both of, sorry.
For me, it won't work very efficiently, solar panels in the UK, because you don't get that much sun here. So it is better to go with the heat insulation.
Okay. Yeah, so so somebody said, he wouldn't go with, he would not go with a solar panel because here in the UK, the energy is not that high. And because of that,
Initially,
because the
investment-
cost of maintaining a solar panel in a country with no sun, you're just gonna waste it.
Yeah. You'll end up paying
You
rather
pay
than
more money than if you were to do normal.
so what if there was enough energy, there was enough sunlight?
If we lived in a sunny area, then yes.
Yes.
Yeah. You prefer that to the photovoltaic?
100%.
100%?
I think he's got a fair point. It's a thriving industry, isn't it? That's why we see solar panels on the roofs. I think what we've got to realize is the solar industry has moved on. I've got three doctors, I've got these solar panels. It depends on something called coefficient. How efficient is the solar panel? I think you need to go and study more into it. I've got air source heat pumps, ground source heat pumps, solar panels. I've studied everything. I've got a few other doctors. I think before we start passing judgments, people need to understand the industry. Solar panels is very, very effective in south of UK. Not only this, you actually have solar parks in UK now. Why? Because solar panels have become more efficient. You know, those big parks, people are investing millions of pounds. So rather than just passing blank judgment, you need to study something.
someone was making an argument regarding solar panels. He
Yeah,
said,
and then there is government subsidy as well. So it all comes down again to returns.
so what you realize here is that all of us are sort of making decisions based on
Yeah.
what various
Yes.
parameters or attributes,
Yeah.
right? Some are making the argument that in the UK there's no sun, while somebody is also saying, I mean, there's been some progress in terms of
Yes.
solar energy
And
installation in
the
the UK.
technology is moved forward, yeah.
So, I mean, you realize that when it comes to comparison between two different systems, right, there's, I mean, aside, let's say, the actual cost, there are some other considerations that go in there. For instance, the energy, the sun, let's say, some sort of efficiency, and yeah, in there. But then, so typically, the two systems are not mutually exclusive, right? You can go in for both, right? If you have to go in for both, right? But then you as the individual may need to evaluate or make some sort of systematic evaluation, right? Which you can always do. Sometimes you may need engineers to help you do that. But here, what we're focusing on more is just the financial consideration, right? Let's ignore all the engineering, let's ignore all the efficiency. We just want to focus purely on the financial consideration. How much will either of these two systems cost? What will be the maintenance cost of these two systems? If we were to replace these two systems, maybe in the next 10 years or 15 years, how much will it cost us to replace those two systems? Right, so purely on financial basis rather than their efficiency or energy consideration. Right. So let's assume we have these two examples. The first example, the photovoltaic, right? In that case, these are the parameters we have, right? It's what's domestic system. I mean, let's assume every year it loses about 1% of its efficiency. So if you started using it now, I mean, if you started using it now, maybe in your maintenance cost is, let's say, £100 for this year. And the next year, it loses its efficiency by 1%, so it may cost a bit more. And then, yeah, we also say every year, and the maintenance requires, so for every 5 years, we need to spend, £100 to be able to maintain the cell. Which means, on a yearly basis, we're spending, about £20. Right. The maintenance, it's about £20.